The object was not supposed to be there. That was the first thing sensor analyst Veth noted in the log. Not a tactical assessment, not an alarm, just that quiet bureaucratic phrase that precedes every catastrophe in every civilization that has ever reached for the stars. The object was not supposed to be there. It was small, roughly 4 meters across, tumbling slowly through the debris field at the edge of the Carthos exclusion zone, which humans had agreed in writing, with 17 witness signatories, to never enter. The object was a human escape pod. Empty. But the asterisk inside of the pod was what stopped Veth's secondary hearts from beating correctly. Because scratched into the interior hull, not painted, not printed, scratched, by something hard and desperate, were 41 sets of human counting marks. 41 days. Someone had been inside it for 41 days. And then they had left. Into a zone where nothing could survive. Where no ship had ever gone. The war, if you could call it that, had been running for 9 months by the time Veth filed her anomaly report. The Galactic Compact, 7 species, 4 centuries of enforced stability, and a legal architecture so elaborate it had its own subspecialty of philosophical mathematics, had not expected humans to fight back. That was the first miscalculation, and it had become the foundational crack in everything that followed. The second miscalculation was subtler and far more dangerous. The Compact had assumed that because they could track every human vessel, every registered freighter, every colonial shuttle, every military hull that humans had publicly commissioned, they therefore knew where human power lived. They tracked 4,400 ships. They watched 4,400 ships with the most sophisticated sensor network in the known galaxy, a web of quantum-entangled relay stations that could detect a single thruster ignition across 6 light-years of drift and correctly identify the vessel's engine signature, mass, crew complement, and last 3 ports of call within 40 seconds. They knew exactly where 4,400 human ships were at all times. The third miscalculation, and this one wouldn't become visible until much later, until it was far too late to matter, was that 4,400 was not the number that mattered. Nobody in the Compact had thought to ask what number asterisk did matter. Veth stared at the counting marks on her display, filed the report. Then, because she was thorough in the way that only truly careful analysts are, she pulled the registration database for every human pod design matching that hull signature. The pod was designated for use aboard Meridian-class colony transports. There were 6 Meridian-class vessels registered to Human Colonial Authority. She checked the location of all 6. All 6 were currently docked at Callaway Station, 90 light-years away, under compact observation, which meant the pod couldn't exist. And yet, 41 marks, scratched by hand, and then someone had walked out the door into nothing. Commander Elena Vasquez had a particular relationship with impossible situations. She developed it early, not through training, not through any philosophical preparation, but through the specific education of watching her mother refuse to leave a hospital chair for 11 days while her father decided, organ by organ, whether he was going to stay alive. Her mother hadn't prayed, hadn't wept publicly, had simply remained, with the particular quality of stillness that isn't peace but is something harder than peace, the kind that looks from the outside like acceptance and is actually something else entirely. She thought about that stillness now, floating in the dark. The Carthos exclusion zone had been classified uninhabitable for reasons the Compact described as navigational hazard in public communiques and described in classified briefings as we lost 3 survey vessels and stopped asking questions. The zone was a gravitational tangle, overlapping fields from a cluster of dead stars, interacting in patterns that the best compact navigation models predicted with approximately 63% accuracy, which meant roughly 1 in 3 predictions was dangerously wrong. No compact species had developed the capacity to operate inside it reliably. The keyword Vasquez had noted when she first read the classified assessment was reliably. "Beacon still dark," said the voice to her left. That was Caro Oduya, her navigator, who had the gift of statting facts in a tone that somehow made them sound like neither panic nor acceptance, just information. Vasquez had come to depend on that tone more than she would ever admit. "It'll come up," Vasquez said. "And if it doesn't, then we already knew that going in." Caro was quiet for a moment. The ship, if you could call it a ship, this thing they'd spent 14 months building in a hollowed asteroid, with no registration number, no engine signature on file anywhere, no mass logged in any database, creaked softly against a gravitational eddy. "The pod made it out," Caro said. "We know that much." "We know it crossed the boundary," Vasquez corrected. "We don't know if Torres made it." Another silence, longer this time. "She made it," Caro said. "Not a statement of certainty. A statement of asterisk necessity. The kind of thing you say when the alternative is not something you can afford to be considering right now." Vasquez said nothing. She looked out at the dead stars. Somewhere out there, 90 light-years away, the Compact was watching 4,400 human ships. None of them were here. Veth's anomaly report climbed 3 levels of review in 48 hours, which was fast enough to mean that other analysts had noticed other things they weren't sure how to classify. By the time it reached Senior Coordinator Heth of the Observation Division, Heth, who had studied humans specifically for 6 years, who had published 4 monographs on human military doctrine, who was considered the foremost compact expert on the species, there were 11 other anomaly reports attached to it. Different zones, different debris fields, different objects, all sharing one characteristic. They were evidence that something human had been somewhere humans could not possibly be. Heth called a meeting. 14 analysts in a room, all of whom had been trained to be skeptical, all of whom arrived already slightly afraid. "The tracking network is showing 4,400 ships in positions consistent with historical behavior," said the first analyst. "No anomalies in the registered fleet." "Then explain these," said Heth, spreading the reports across the room's central display. The analysts looked. Several of them were quiet in ways that suggested they had been quiet about the same thing already. "The simplest explanation," said one of the younger analysts, Pell, newly assigned, not yet trained to be careful about saying the simplest explanation out loud, "is that there are more ships." "Ships we don't know about," said another voice. "Ships that don't appear in any registry. Ships that aren't in our sensor range at all. Ships," Heth said quietly, cutting through the overlapping voices, "that are apparently in places ships cannot go." The room became very still. "Pull everything we have on unregistered human construction," Heth said. "Every asteroid survey, every mining claim, every colonial requisition for raw materials that exceeded stated project requirements, every instance where a human requested mapping data for a location they then never filed construction permits for." He paused. "And pull the Carthos navigational models. I want to know if there's any configuration of trajectory that could get a vessel in and out of that zone alive." "With what probability threshold?" asked Pell. Heth looked at him steadily. "Start at 40%, he said. "I suspect we'll find the humans weren't using a much higher one." The navigational mathematics of the Carthos exclusion zone had a particular quality that compact scientists described as chaotic, and that Vasquez's chief engineer, a man named Drago who had previously spent 8 years navigating asteroid belts that mining consortiums had declared unnavigable, described as annoying but learnable. The distinction was philosophical, but it was also tactical. Compact navigation models predicted gravitational interactions by solving for stable configurations, the underlying assumption being that a safe path was one that remained consistently safe. This was sensible. It was also, in a zone defined by overlapping dead star fields where no configuration was stable for more than 6 hours. A methodology that generated predictions with a 63% success rate because it was fundamentally asking the wrong question. Drago didn't look for stable paths. Drago looked for asterisk sequences. He'd learned this in the belts, not through calculation, but through the accumulated body knowledge of 3 near disasters and 1 actual disaster that he'd walked away from because the emergency seal on his suit had been rated to 400 newtons of compressive force, and the bulkhead that hit him had exerted 387. "It's not about finding the safe road," he'd told Vasquez when he first explained his approach. "It's about knowing which road is safe right now, and how long you have before it isn't, and what road becomes safe next, and how fast you can get there." "That sounds like it requires continuous calculation," she'd said. "It does." "For how long?" He'd looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has answered this question in their own head many times and made peace with the answer. "The whole time you're in there." That had been the moment Vasquez understood what this mission would actually cost. Not in strategy, not in materiel, in the sheer sustained effort of human minds doing something they couldn't stop doing even for a moment, because the moment they stopped, the math became fatal. They'd been inside the zone for 19 days. Drago had not slept more than 4 hours consecutively in 19 days. Neither had the 3 navigators who rotated with him. They'd rigged a system, mathematical handoffs, state logs, overlapping watch periods, that was less a solution to the problem of human fatigue and more an acknowledgement that human fatigue was a variable that had to be managed rather than eliminated. "How are we holding?" Vasquez asked, stepping into the navigation bay. Drago looked up from his display. His eyes had that particular quality of focus that exists on the other side of exhaustion, not alertness, but something more absolute, like a wire drawn too tight to vibrate. "We're holding," he said. "Current corridor is stable for another 4 hours. I've got the next 3 transitions plotted. And after 3, I'll plot 4 more." He paused. "We're getting closer to the center mass. The interactions are more complex. Each transition is taking longer to model. Tell me what you need." He was quiet for a moment, in the way of people doing arithmetic about things that aren't numbers. "I need Tors to have gotten the message out," he said finally. "I need to know we're not in here for nothing." Tors had gotten the message out. This was the thing that Veth's anomaly report, climbing through the levels of compact review, was unknowingly about to confirm. Because the message Tors had sent scratching 41 days of waiting into a pod hull, then walking out into the Carthos boundary, and crossing it alive on a trajectory that compact navigational models said was possible with a 31% success rate, which she had considered acceptable. That message had not been a distress signal. It hadn't been coordinates, hadn't been military intelligence, hadn't been a communication at all in the conventional sense. It was an asterisk question, delivered in the most specific possible language. The question was, "Are you watching?" And the answer, given by the 11 anomaly reports now spread across Heth's conference table, was, "Yes, we're watching, and we still don't understand what we're looking at." Which was precisely what Vasquez had planned for. Heth had been studying humans for 6 years, and believed he understood them better than any other compact analyst. His 4 monographs covered human military history, human psychological stress responses, human negotiation patterns, and his most widely cited work, Human Strategic Doctrine, which he had characterized as inherently reactive, tactically creative, and strategically bounded by an instinct for de-escalation that can be activated by sufficient cost imposition. In other words, he'd written 400 pages explaining why humans would eventually surrender. He was reading his own work now, in his office, at 2 in the morning, and experiencing the specific discomfort of an expert realizing that his expertise had been built on a foundation with a missing piece. He pressed his communicator, Pell. A pause. Pell was young enough to still be sleeping. Yes, coordinator. My fourth monograph, Heth said. The section on human surrender thresholds. I cite the Kerrigan War as the primary historical example. The human withdrawal from Kerrigan. What was the duration of that conflict before withdrawal? A pause, the sound of Pell locating the reference. 4 years, sir, and a loss of approximately 11% of their deployed military capacity. And the settlement terms. Humans accepted a buffer zone and withdrew from 3 contested systems. Right, Heth stared at his office ceiling. Pull me the casualty projections for the current conflict, current human losses. I can pull the estimates, but coordinator, the tracking data for. I know what the tracking data shows, Heth said. Pull me the estimates. Another pause, longer. Then, coordinator, by our estimates, humans have already lost approximately 9% of their trackable military capacity, and the contested systems show no indication of withdrawal preparation. Heth sat with that for a moment. No indication, he repeated. None, sir. They're at 9% losses. The Kerrigan precedent triggered withdrawal at 11, and there's no indication. Correct, sir. Heth thought about the escape pod. The counting marks. 41 days, and then someone had walked asterisk out into a zone that should have been impassable, apparently willingly, apparently on schedule, as though it had always been the plan. Pell, he said, what if the ships we're tracking aren't their military capacity? What if there's something else? The silence on the other end was the particular silence of a young analyst whose mind has just been pushed to the edge of a conclusion that feels too large to say out loud. Then, we don't know what their actual capacity is, Pell said carefully. No, Heth said, we don't, which means my surrender threshold calculation is based on. Wrong numbers. Wrong numbers, Heth confirmed. Get me everything, now, not in the morning, now. This was the moment, though none of them knew it yet, when the Compact's understanding of what it was fighting began its fundamental collapse. Not a dramatic collapse. Not yet. Just a crack running through the foundation, invisible from the outside, the kind that structural engineers have nightmares about specifically because you cannot see it until something shifts. What Heth had not yet realized, pulling his data in the small hours of a morning that would later be classified as the beginning of the Compact's most consequential intelligence failure, was that the registered fleet, the 4,400 ships they watched with obsessive precision, was itself part of the plan. The 4,400 ships were not a camouflage for the real fleet. They were not a decoy. They were not a shell game. They were an asterisk question. The same question Torres had asked from inside the pod. Are you watching? Because Vasquez needed them watching the 4,400, needed their sensors committed, their analysts occupied, their computational predictions focused on a fleet that behaved with the exact level of predictability required to seem like the asterisk-only asterisk fleet. And inside the Carthos exclusion zone, in a ship that existed in no registry, on a trajectory that compact models said was barely survivable, 19 days of continuous impossible navigation complete, Vasquez received the signal she'd been waiting for. Not a communication, not in any format the Compact would have recognized as a signal at all. A specific gravitational pulse, generated by a relay they'd left at the zone boundary, triggered by a specific sequence of mass movements outside the zone that would look, to any Compact sensor, like routine navigational adjustment of a registered freighter. Torres had gotten out. Torres had gotten to the contacts. The second phase had begun. Vasquez read the signal twice, then looked at Caro. Tell Drago we're moving to the secondary corridor, she said. Caro nodded, didn't smile, they were long past smiling. And the beacon. Leave it dark, Vasquez said, if they find it. They'll think it's a malfunction. They'll think it's a malfunction, she agreed. Let them. The secondary corridor took 8 more days. On day 23 inside the zone, Drago's second navigator, a woman named Inez who had joined the crew partly because she was an exceptional mathematician and partly because her entire home colony was currently under compact occupation and she had not heard from her family in 7 months, sat down in the middle of the navigation bay floor and did not get up. Not a collapse, not a medical emergency. She sat down cross-legged, in the specific way of a person who has calculated the distance to the next moment and found it requires more than they currently have. Vasquez came in 10 minutes later and sat down next to her on the floor. I can't stop seeing it, Inez said, not explaining, just saying it the way you say something when it has been true for so long that concealing it has become more effort than the truth. The path forward, the nodes. I close my eyes and the model is still running. I know, Vasquez said. I'm afraid if I sleep, the others will hold the thread. But what if? Inez, Vasquez's voice was quiet. It was not a voice for speeches. It was a voice for a hospital chair at 2 in the morning. You are allowed to let go for 4 hours. The mission doesn't end if you rest. You don't know that. No, I don't. A pause. But I know that if you don't rest, the mission definitely ends. So rest is the better bet. Inez looked at her for a moment. Then she lay down on the navigation bay floor, one arm over her eyes, and within 3 minutes was asleep. Drago, at his console, did not turn around, but he exhaled one long, controlled breath in a way that meant he'd been holding something that he could now briefly put down. She's been carrying that for 6 days, he said quietly. I know. You always know, he said, not an accusation, something more complicated. How? My mother taught me, Vasquez said simply. She did not explain further. Drago, to his credit, did not ask. He returned to his calculations. The dead stars wheeled around them in their slow, complex, lethal patterns, and the ship that wasn't in any database threaded through them on mathematics that shouldn't have worked, piloted by people who refused to be stopped by the difference between asterisk shouldn't and won't. Heth's revised analysis landed on the Supreme Coordinator's desk on the morning of day 24 inside the zone, and the Supreme Coordinator, a being who had governed complex systems for 40 years and was not easily alarmed, read it twice and then sat very still for a long time. The analysis contained one core conclusion. The compact could not establish an accurate assessment of human military capacity. The registered fleet was probably not representative. The anomalous evidence suggested construction activity in locations that should have been impossible to use. The surrender threshold models were unreliable. And the part that the Supreme Coordinator read 3 times, because it was both the most important and the most disturbing. There was no intelligence indicating that humans had asterisked a surrender threshold that had been reached, despite losses that by any historical measure should have triggered negotiated withdrawal. The implications, Heth wrote with the careful phrasing of an analyst who does not want to be blamed for the thing he is clearly saying, were significant. Get me Heth, said the Supreme Coordinator. Heth arrived within the hour, and he arrived already knowing that the conversation was going to require him to say the next thing out loud, the thing he hadn't quite written in the analysis, the thing he'd been circling for 4 days. The escape pod, the Supreme Coordinator said without preamble. The one in the Carthos boundary, what was it for? Heth had prepared 3 answers to this question, and none of them felt adequate. He chose the most honest one. I believe it was a test, he said. I believe a human was inside that zone long enough to survive and exit. And I believe the fact that we found asterisk the pod and the counting marks and the evidence of survival, I believe that was intentional. They wanted us to find it. Yes. Why? Heth was quiet for a moment. Because it changes what we think is possible. he said. It expands the space of what we have to consider, and an enemy whose possible actions expand beyond your model is uncontainable, the Supreme Coordinator said quietly. Uncontainable, Heth confirmed. The Supreme Coordinator was silent. Then, are there ships inside that zone right now? Our sensors can't penetrate it reliably. We genuinely don't know. What's your estimate? Heth hesitated, which for him was significant. I would estimate yes, he said, and I would estimate they've been there since before the conflict escalated, which means they were planning this before they showed us the registered fleet. He paused, which means the registered fleet was never the point. The Supreme Coordinator looked at him for a long time. The fleet we've been watching for 9 months. Was what they wanted us to watch, Heth said. Yes, sir. On day 27, they reached the other side. There was no ceremony to it. No moment of collective release. The ship crossed the boundary of the Carthos exclusion zone on the far side, the side that no compact vessel had ever approached, the side that faced toward the cluster of systems the compact had not bothered heavily fortifying because nothing could approach from that direction. And the dead stars fell away behind them, and the open dark ahead was full of things that were not stars. Ships. Not 4,400, a different number. They had been built in asteroid belts designated as survey, only. In planetary systems the compact had assessed as resource poor, and therefore unworthy of monitoring. In the hollow interiors of 14 moons across 6 different systems, each moon having been quietly, incrementally, over the course of 11 years, converted into something between a shipyard and a fortress, by a species that the compact had described as pre-galactic in its construction capacity, 8 years ago, in an assessment that was accurate at the time, and was now wrong in a way that had very large consequences. Reading the array, Caro said. Her voice was controlled, but something underneath it wasn't. Commander, I'm reading the array. Vasquez looked at the display. She had known this moment was coming, had planned for it, calculated it, pushed through 19 days and then 8 more days of impossible navigation for it, had sat on the floor of the navigation bay next to a woman who could not stand anymore and told her to rest so that they could arrive at this exact moment. She had known it was coming, and it still hit her in a way she hadn't fully prepared for. 312 ships, unregistered, unseen, never once detected by the most sophisticated sensor network in the known galaxy because they had never been in the galaxy the sensor network was watching. They had been asterisk here, behind the impassable zone, waiting. Waiting for the signal that Torres had delivered, that had activated the second phase, that Vasquez had now completed by arriving at the rendezvous point. Open a channel, she said. Her voice was her mother's voice, still in the way that isn't peace. Channel open, Commander. She looked at the 312 ships for a moment, at the evidence of 11 years of quiet, sustained, invisible work, at the answer to Heth's question, even though Heth didn't know the question had been answered yet. This is Commander Elena Vasquez, she said. Pathfinder is through. Navigation data is uploading now. You have the corridor. A pause. Then a voice she hadn't heard in 27 days, the Fleet Admiral, running cold on the other side of the zone for 11 months, waiting, holding this fleet together through 11 months of waiting with the particular discipline of people who understand that the most dangerous part of a long plan is the part where you do nothing. Commander Vasquez, your passage time. 27 days. A longer pause. She knew what the Admiral was calculating. 27 days was 4 days longer than the original estimate, which meant 4 days of additional drift in the plan's timing, which meant adjustments. Can you reduce that with the navigation data? She looked at Drago. Drago, who had not slept more than 4 hours consecutively in 27 days, turned in his chair and looked at her with those wire-drawn eyes, and did the arithmetic that wasn't numbers and said, 18 days, if the corridor holds. She passed it through. The Admiral received it. 18 days, the Admiral confirmed. Then we move. Heth was still in the Supreme Coordinator's office when his alerts began firing. Not one alert, not two, 17 in the span of 4 seconds, which was the exact number of quantum relay stations in the inner defense perimeter that had simultaneously detected gravitational signatures consistent with vessel emergence. Not from known space, not from any registered approach vector, but from the direction of the Carthos exclusion zone. From the direction that was not possible. He looked at his display. The Supreme Coordinator looked at his own. They looked at each other. That's Pell's voice in Heth's earpiece. 2 octaves higher than usual. Coordinator, that's emerging from the asterisk zone. That's. How many? Heth asked. The stillness in his voice surprised him. A pause that felt like falling. Still counting, Pell said. Coordinator, the signatures are there, not in our database. None of them are matching anything in our database. There, another pause. They're asterisk new. Of course they were new. They'd been built where no one was watching. They were flying out of the place no one could follow. They were part of a fleet that did not exist in any registry because it had been constructed, piece by piece, across 11 years, in the deliberate knowledge that the Compact would be watching 4,400 ships and calling that sufficient. How many? Heth said again. Pell said the number. Heth closed his eyes. He thought about the escape pod, the 41 marks scratched into the hull, the question Tors had asked, "Are you watching?" And the answer that had drawn the Compact's gaze to exactly the right place to miss everything that mattered. He thought about his 4 monographs, the surrender threshold, the 11% loss calculation, the confident analysis that humans would de-escalate when costs became sufficient. He thought about the 9% loss they had already absorbed without flinching. He thought about 27 days inside a zone that should have been impassable, and the navigation data that was now uploading to 312 ships, and the corridor that would be traversable in 18 days, and the Compact's inner systems, which were not fortified on that facing. Supreme Coordinator, he said very quietly. I know, said the Supreme Coordinator. The registered fleet, the 4,400, I need to know if any of them have repositioned in the last. They've repositioned, the Supreme Coordinator said. His voice had the quality of someone reading a verdict. All of them, in the last 6 hours, while we were in this office. So the 4,400 were moving now too. The question had become the answer. The decoy had become the second arm of a pincer that had been planned long before any of them understood the shape of the trap. They weren't watching us, Heth said, and he could hear in his own voice the specific quality of a man who has just understood something enormous. We thought we were watching them, but they were watching us. The whole time. They needed to know which direction we'd reinforce when the zone fleet emerged. They needed us to telegraph our response. And we just... He couldn't finish it. He didn't need to. The Supreme Coordinator was already moving. But moving is different from in time. The battle historians would later argue about whether battle was the right word, lasted 4 days on the conventional facing, and continued for 11 more days in the systems behind the zone, where the 312 unregistered ships moved with the specific confidence of a force that had spent 11 months in stillness, and was now in motion with every decision already made, every contingency already planned, every commander already certain of their role, because there had been nothing to do for 11 months except know their role with absolute precision. On the 3rd day of the conventional engagement, Heth sent a communication to the human fleet commander. Not a tactical communication, not a surrender overture. He sent it because he had been studying humans for 6 years, and he had a question he needed answered, and he understood, with the clarity of a man whose professional framework has just been comprehensively dismantled, that he might not have another chance to ask. The response came from Vasquez. He had not expected that. He had not known until that moment that the Pathfinder commander and the strategic architect of the entire campaign were the same person. "The pod," he transmitted. "The counting marks 41 days. A pause, long enough that he wondered if she would respond at all. "She wanted to know if you were thorough," Vasquez finally answered. "If we sent something that should be impossible, would you find it? Would you follow it? Would you commit resources to understanding it?" "She." "Tours, it was her idea," she said. "Give them something they can't explain. They'll spend 3 months trying to explain it, and while they're explaining it—" Heth finished the thought before she did. "You'd be navigating." "We'd be navigating," Vasquez confirmed. Heth sat with that for a moment. "You used our thoroughness against us," he said. "Not an accusation, a recognition." "We used your certainty against you," she said, "and the distinction mattered. You were certain you knew how many ships we had. You were certain the zone was impassable. You were certain about our surrender threshold." A pause. "We weren't certain about anything. We just kept moving." He thought about the 4 monographs, the surrender threshold, the 19 kinds of certainty he'd written down in careful academic prose. "How long?" he said. "The plan, how long?" 11 years, she said, "since before the conflict started." 11 years. While the Compact had watched 4,400 ships with perfect, comprehensive, useless precision. "One more question," he said. "Go ahead. Was there ever a version of this plan in which you didn't go through the zone yourself?" The pause this time was different, personal. "No," she said. "I couldn't ask anyone to do it first." He closed the channel. He sat in his office, which was now located in a facility that, by his own estimation, had approximately 40 hours before it became inaccessible, and he did something he had not done in his professional life. He reopened his 4 monographs. He went to the section on human surrender thresholds. He did not delete it. He simply wrote in the margin in his own notation a single word. "Wrong." And then below it, "They don't calculate when to stop. They decide once to not stop, and then they manage everything else around that decision." He looked at what he'd written for a long time. Then he evacuated with the others. Later, much later, after the settlement terms had been negotiated, after the buffer zones had been redrawn, after the Compact's historians had begun the slow and uncomfortable work of understanding what had actually happened, a researcher named Pell, who had been promoted twice for his role in the intelligence analysis and was now considered one of the foremost human scholars in the Compact, found Tours. She was on a station near the Carthos boundary, working as a navigator for an independent survey operation. She had the look of a person who has decided what matters to them and arranged their life around that decision. "The pod," Pell said. He'd spent 2 years working up to this conversation. 41 days, the zone crossing. Were you afraid? Tours looked at him with the particular expression of someone who has been asked a question they find genuinely interesting. "Of course," she said. "Then why?" "Because the plan needed it," she said simply, "and I was available." She looked out at the boundary, the zone where the dead stars still wheeled in their complex, lethal patterns. "We didn't have better options. We had the option that was available, so." "That's it?" Pell asked. "That's the whole reasoning?" Tours considered this for a moment. What other reasoning would there be? Pell had no answer for that. He had studied humans for 3 years, had read every analysis Heth had ever written, had access to classified accounts of the campaign that most scholars wouldn't see for decades. He still had no answer for that. Maybe that was the point. In the final Compact Intelligence Review, the one that would define doctrine for the next century, Heth's testimony contained one passage that was later removed from the public record, apparently for being too uncomfortable to include in an official document. Pell had read the unredacted version, and he remembered the passage. We made one assumption we never examined, that a rational species in an unfavorable strategic position will eventually calculate the cost of continuing and choose to stop. We have always been correct about this. Every species we have encountered has a threshold, a point where the math becomes undeniable and the decision becomes obvious. Humans do not appear to make this calculation the way we do. They make a different calculation, earlier, once, privately, about whether the thing they are fighting for is worth whatever it costs. And if the answer is yes, then the subsequent costs do not reopen that calculation. They are simply variables to be managed on the way to an outcome that has already been decided. We cannot model this. We cannot predict the threshold because there is no threshold. There is only the original decision. And then the management of everything that follows. I am aware of no other species in our records that functions this way. I am aware of no defense against it. You cannot impose enough cost to change the calculation, because the calculation is already done. The ships in the Carthos zone were never the threat. The threat was the people inside them, who had already decided and were now simply navigating. The review board had read that passage and agreed, quietly and without discussion, that it was not appropriate for the official record, not because it was wrong, because it was true in a way that had no good response. In the Carthos exclusion zone, the dead stars continued their slow, complex dance. The gravitational fields shifted in their overlapping patterns. The corridors opened and closed in their 6-hour cycles, dangerous and navigable and impossible in that specific order that Drago had learned to read like breath. No compact vessel went in. They'd have needed someone willing to spend 27 days finding the path. They looked at the zone, and they thought about the counting marks and the empty pod, and the woman who had walked out of it into nothing because the plan needed it and she was available. And they decided, rationally, sensibly, with all the wisdom of 4 centuries of accumulated civilization,